So last summer I was on a hike with a friend of mine out near Cle Elum in central Washington. It was July or so, I suppose. And he told me about this great place we could go to, which was about 3,500, 4,000 feet hike up into the Cascades, where we could get to this really beautiful spot where we could have this nice vista of the enchantments and the Cascades as they kind of unfold out to the north, towards the North Cascades. And I said, sure, let's go give it a try. So we went. It was a very hot day, and this trail was extremely hard. It was dusty. It was hot. Most of it was in the trees, and we were just doing switchbacks. And for any of you that have done like Mount Si out here, you've lived it before, the purgatory of the switchbacks in the trees. And we're just going back and forth for like at least an hour and a half or so, and we're plugging along, and it was hot and dusty, and I was starting to get a little bit tired, and I started to bemoan our situation to my friend, and I said, well, are we almost there? Or how much farther is this going to go? And he said, just hold on, couple more minutes, I got something for you. Okay, so we kept going, and sure enough, we eventually come to this little spot where there was a little rock outcropping that came out from the trees. For those of you, I hike quite a bit up here on Squawk Mountain. And for some of you, maybe you've been to the little viewpoint up there on Squawk Mountain where you have to kind of hike, like, I forget what it's called, Elizabeth Point or something, I don't know. But it's the only place on the whole mountain where you can get an open view, right? Otherwise, you're in the trees the whole time, and you can see Mount Rainier and all sorts of nice things. So there's this little rock outcropping, so we went out onto this rock outcropping, and he said, look up there. So we kind of take a look, and you could see where we were going. You could see the top of the mountain we were heading for. And it looked beautiful, right? There it was. There was like a little bit of snow from an old glacier, and it was all sunny up there. It looked like the wind was moving through, and he said, that's where we're heading. It's right up there. And to be honest, it was motivating for me, because then I could actually see, okay, well, fair enough. We can kind of keep pushing on a little bit. We got some water, ate some food, renewed our energy, and then kept going. After about another hour, some hard work, eventually we got there, and sure enough, it was wonderful. Beautiful alpine meadow, all sorts of flowers were out, it was sunny. We got some food, prayed for a bit, beautiful vistas, just great. Perfect, like, summer afternoon, right, in the Cascades. That image, perhaps, I find helpful, especially as we talk about the Transfiguration tonight. See, because Jesus is giving the disciples and us a little foretaste. Because even sometimes when the path is hard, Jesus is saying, don't worry, this is where we're heading. You have to understand the context here in Mark, because Mark is only 16 chapters long, the whole gospel, and this is right at the beginning of chapter 9. So that means the disciples have been on the journey, and Jesus has been healing and teaching and preaching for about 7 or 8 chapters, halfway through the book. And this part as well in Mark, right before what had happened, was that Jesus had asked Peter and the disciples, who do people say that I am? And Peter comes through, you're the Messiah. No problem. But then Jesus says, well, the Messiah has to be offered up. Right? I'm going to have to die for the sins of others. And Peter says, no, don't do that. And then Jesus berates him, right? Get behind me, Satan. And then Jesus goes on to talk more and say, to be a disciple of me means that you have to deny yourself and take up your cross. And disciples are thinking, that's a lot of work. Right? And we've been with you to this point, but that's a lot of work. And so right in the next little moment, Jesus takes 3 of the disciples up onto the mountain and is transfigured, giving them a foretaste of heaven, a foretaste of the resurrection and the promises of the Messiah, the purpose of Christ coming in human form, to bring us that fullness of life. And it should be, at this point in the gospel, enough to keep the disciples going now as Jesus is going to push on towards Jerusalem. Now they've seen a foretaste, so they can remain faithful. They can keep doing the hard work right now, even when it seems like it's not quite going the way they want it to go, or it's a little bit more difficult than they anticipated, because now they have that little taste. Kind of like me and my buddy out on the rock. Oh, okay. It's motivating. Now, what we find for ourselves is that as Jesus is there and he's transfigured, The disciples are present there and says, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." The same thing we heard when Jesus was baptized, that there's this intimate relationship between the Son and the Father. And that the Father loves us so much that he's willing to give over his Son, just as we saw intimated in Abraham and his son Isaac. That Abraham loved Yahweh so much he was willing to give his son to do God's will. And then the response that we have and what we see is that Jesus is able to fulfill the law and the prophets. That's why Moses and Elijah show up to him, right next to him, and he's conversing with them. Right? That's the historical, the past that Jesus comes to fulfill. The law, Moses, the prophets, Elijah, the greatest of all the prophets, the Word made flesh. And he will fulfill this mission in the disciples that are there, who will carry out this ongoing mission of the risen Christ in the church, in us. Now, this past week, I had moments where I had a foretaste of heaven. Opportunities to see, because really that's what the Transfiguration is. It's a foretaste, it's a showing of what we are promised. Even when I was here on Friday night, I came for the Stations of the Cross, which was quite wonderful because I didn't have to lead it, right? I was here, along for the prayers. And it had been a while since I'd done the Stations of the Cross, and I had an opportunity to sit here and pray. And I'll be honest, God gave me some spiritual consolation at that moment. When I was praying, I felt close to Christ. I was able to take some time in silence and just kind of be still. Foretaste of heaven. That kind of intimate relationship with God is what we're promised all the time. Then earlier in the week, on Wednesday, I had the opportunity to hear a confession of a man who had not been back to church for over 40 years. And he came back and he said, "Oh, I don't know, Father, the Spirit's moving. I feel like I'm supposed to come back." And so we sat down and we chatted and talked about his wife that had passed away before. And I got to listen to him come and reconcile himself before God and be forgiven. And with tears coming down his eyes, he said, "I thank God for this opportunity." Foretaste of heaven. Reconciled with one another and with God. Right? That vision, right? The transfiguration of Christ. The risen Christ present in our midst again. And of course, key for all of us whenever we celebrate the Eucharist, when we gather together at Mass, we believe Christ is transfigured again for us here. That we have a foretaste of heaven when we celebrate the Eucharist. That this type of meal, this type of sacrifice, brings us into union with God and with one another beyond our imaginings. That is a foretaste of that perfect relationship that we will have with Christ and with one another in heaven. Every time we celebrate the Eucharist. When I was on that hike with my friend, right? Hard sometimes, get a little bit tired, a little discouraged. But then we had that little treat. Right? Motivating factor. Right? Foretaste of where we were heading. Then it gave us new energy. Should be the same for us as we gather in the season of Lent. We're given the Transfiguration just as the disciples were. Keep them motivated. Even when times are hard. Even when it doesn't seem like things make sense. Even when it's hard to follow Christ. We are given that foretaste of heaven. The foretaste of perfect relationship with Christ.